All right, when we talk about relative maximum, relative minimum point, let's talk about the idea of a point. You know what points are? A point has an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate, right? So when we talk about relative, we're talking about a localized area. We're talking about a localized area. All right, so you see these two paper clips? Just a localized area. So you're looking at a small portion. You're looking at a small portion of the domain. Looking at a small portion of the domain. You're not looking at the whole thing. You're looking at small portions of this domain, and you're asking yourself, where is there a minimum point and where is there a maximum point? The first graph is easy to deal with because you can look at this. As I go from decreasing, and then all of a sudden I did what? Increase. That point right here is considered a relative what? Min. Then all of a sudden I'm increasing, and then I have a turning point. I use the word turning point. And then it started decreasing. So in this little vicinity of that localized domain right here, what happened to my y values? I went from increasing to what? Decreasing. So this point right here that I'm pointing to would be considered a relative max. Okay? So relative, think localized. In a local area. Okay? So for right now, think of a relative max, relative min as a turning point. As you go from decreasing to increasing, or as you go from increasing to decreasing. So this example is pretty easy to deal with at this point. So I'm going to put a dot here, and I'm going to say this is my relative minimum point. Okay? Relative minimum point. There is a difference between relative and absolute. We're not talking about absolute in here. We're only talking about relative. Over here, that is going to be considered a what? Relative maximum point. A relative maximum point. Now, when you look at that worksheet, the direction says something like this, though. It says, at what values of x is f of x a relative maximum? And then a relative minimum. Okay? So when it says this, and MyMathLab will say this, it will say this. What is the value of the relative minimum? Now be careful. I'm not asking for the point. You located the point. So notice when I wrote this, I said relative minimum point. Relative maximum point. Now, those of you that are going to calculus, all this is going to play important roles next semester or 2 semesters from now. When I ask you what is the value of the relative minimum, I'm asking for the y value. So what is the value of the relative minimum? You're going to say what? -2. Because if you label that point, if you label the relative minimum point, that is -1 comma what? -2. So the value of the relative minimum is what? -2. What is the value of the relative maximum? So if I label that point, I'm going to get 1 comma 2, right? So what is the value of the relative maximum? 2. So you just got to remember that when I talk about values, and it goes back to the function values, right? So when we found f of 3, that was my function value. F of 3, let's say, was 6. 6 was your value. What's the y value in x's? Whatever it was. Your worksheet, though, says like this, though. It'll say, for this example, it'll say something like, at what values of x is f of x a relative min? So you can say x equal what? X equal what? -1. So it helps if you label that point. Then it says, and the relative min is blank, -2. You understand how this and these relate? So at what values of x is f of x the relative min? What's the x value right here? What's the x value? -1. What is the relative min? -2. Notice I didn't say what's the relative minimum point. I said just what's the relative min. So I'm talking about the y value there. And then over here, it would say something like this. I'm going to go ahead and put that right here. At what values of x is f of x a relative max? So you can say x equal blank. What is it? 1. And the relative max is blank, 2. Okay? All right. Now, let's look at number 2. Number 2 is going to be a little bit challenging.
So you have 2 maxes and 2 minimums?
No, there's only one max. Right here, and there's your min. There's your max, there's your min. Relative, at what value of x is a relative min? And then I'm asking for what is the relative min? So one's the x value, the other's the y value. Huh? What about it? Okay, listen to the question. Okay, so the question is this. At what values of x is there a relative max? What is the x value? 1. What is the relative max? 2. There's only one relative maximum point, and there's only one relative minimum point. One question is asking for the x value, the other question is asking for the y value of each. All right, now number 2 is going to be a little bit tricky for some of you. When we talked about the relative max, relative min, we talked about that little local area. So you see this point right here where the graph starts, and I'm looking at the domain or lack of domain on either side. So if you see this right here, see right here, that point right here would be considered a relative what? Max. In fact, if we did talk about this, this would be an absolute because that's the highest point you see. Absolute meaning the highest or the lowest. But it's a relative. Then are any of these points relative mins? No. So then all of a sudden, I come to this point right here. Look at this right here. And that point right here is what? A relative min. In fact, listen carefully. In fact, all of these are relative mins. All of these points right here are relative mins. Those are minimums, right? Then all of a sudden, I'm increasing, and this happens to be a relative what? Max. So relative max, all these right here are relative what? Mins, and then max. So for right now, just think of it this way. When I did this right here, you see how the colors changed? See how the colors changed? They changed here, so that part was a relative what? Min. It's easy to see because you went from decreasing to something different, constant. But they're all constant, so all these have to be the same thing. They're all relative what? Mins. And then there's no arrow here, so this has to be a maximum. And what is that maximum? It's a relative maximum. Same thing applied here. See where the colors changed? So that's a relative what? Min. See where the colors changed? So that's a relative what? Max. So help yourself with doing the colors. All right, now here's how you're going to state it. So that's going to help you with number 2. So number 2 is going to be like what we're about to do here. So it's going to say this. At what values of x is f of x a relative maximum? So x equal blank. And the relative maximum is our blank. All right, so let's talk about that for a moment. The relative maximum idea is going to be easy in this case. How many relative maximums are there? 2. There are 2 of them. This right here is a maximum, and this right here is a what? Maximum. So there are 2 of them. So there are 2 relative maximums here. So relative max. What's that point? -5, 4. And then here's the other one. Relative max. I should say point. And what is that point? 3, 3. Okay. So there are 2 of them. 2 relative maximum points. One's actually an absolute. But you have to know that. So then you're going to say this. At what values of x is the function a relative max? You're going to say x equal what? -5, comma, and what's the other one? 3. Don't put that in parentheses. Just leave it as -5, comma, 3. What are the relative maximum values? 4, comma, 3. 4, comma, 3. All right. Now, let's talk about relative min. How many relative mins are there? A bunch, but I prefer to use what word? An infinite number of them. All these points right here are relative mins. All of them. All these are minimum values. Okay, so listen carefully. at what values of x is f of x a relative min, x equal blank, and the relative min is blank. All right, so write that down. At what values of x is f of x a relative min? And then what is or that value? Let's talk about the value. The one that goes in this blank right here. What is that y value right here? 1. So 1's the only thing that goes here. 1 is my minimum value, right? That's my smallest y value, is 1. You can see that. The smallest y value in that graph is 1. But what x's go with it, though? It's from where? Negative 2 to 1. So you got to put that in parentheses. Actually, you're talking about this in terms of domains. So you can say negative 2 to 1. If you put in bracket or parentheses, that's fine. It really should be in brackets. But it's an interval, right? It's an interval. So from negative 2 to 1, what's my smallest y value? 1. Okay? Let's go to another one. The more you do, the easier it becomes. And I actually put it on the wrong sheet. I meant to put it on this one, so I'm going to have to go back and transfer it. All right, let's look at number 3. All right, now listen carefully to that one. You see, this is not an error right here, so you can consider this a what? Relative max. Then it's decreasing, 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 and all of a sudden it changes to what? Constant. So all of these right here would be considered a relative min. So all these points would be considered relative min. Then all of a sudden it just does what? Increase. So consider that one versus the previous one. How many relative maximums were there? 2. Here there's only what? 1. All right, so you're going to say at what values, plural or singular, of x is f of x a relative max? You're going to say x equal what? Label your point. That's negative 5 comma 4. So you can say negative 5. And what is that relative max? The relative max is 4. Okay? But there is a relative min as well, right? So you're going to say at what values of x is f of x a relative min? This time you're going to say that interval. What's that interval?
Bracket negative 2 comma 1.
Okay? You could put parentheses there if you want to. And the relative min is what? It's just 1. All these y values are 1s. So when you look at this worksheet, and I'll do more of this next class period, but I just want you to look at this worksheet for right now. Number 1 is straightforward in terms of the relative max, relative min. How many relative max are there? 1. How many relative mins are there? 1. Okay. In number 2, how many relative maximums are there? 2. Good. How many relative minimums are there? An infinite number. But what is that relative min -1. Okay? All right, so we'll do more with this the next class period when we meet. But I think for right now, I'm going to give you a different worksheet on this with some other kind of problems with this. But for right now, you should have enough information to be able to do these two problems. So tomorrow, you're going to work on these two problems together. That's what you're going to do tomorrow. Is that clear?